Great. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us for best-selling author Dawn Tripp discussing Jackie, a novel about Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. So best-selling author Dawn Tripp is here tonight to discuss her new novel, Jackie, in conversation with author Sara DiVello. So Jackie, briefly here, Jackie is the story of a woman deeply private with a nuanced, formidable intellect who forged a legacy out of grief and shaped history even as she was living it. It's the story of a love affair, a complicated marriage, and the fracturing of identity that comes in the wake of unthinkable violence. A little bit about Dawn. Dawn is the author of the novel Georgia, which was a national bestseller, a finalist for the New England Book Award, and the winner of the Mary Lynn Kotz Award for Art and Literature. She is also the author of 3 previous novels, Game of Secrets, Moontide, and The Season of Open Water, which won the Massachusetts Book Award for Fiction. Her poems and essays have appeared in the Virginia Quarterly Review, in the Harvard Review, in Conjunctions, as well as NPR, among others. And then a little bit about Sara tonight. So Sara is a moderator and event producer for the Boston Book Festival. She's the co-chair of the Nantucket Book Festival. I recently learned she's on the board of her local Friends of the Library at one of the, I believe, Boston Public Library branch libraries. And she's also an author in her own right. She's the author of Broadway Butterfly, which is a true crime historical novel. And I, again, just briefly want to thank the Friends of the Library for their generous sponsorship of all our programs. So all nearly 200 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Sara and Dawn for being with us tonight. And Sara, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you, everybody, for being here with us together tonight, united in our love of reading and books and libraries. I'm so excited to be with you because I have to tell you, I love this beautiful, brilliant book so much. And I have so many notes to talk about. You can see all of my little CVS receipts and Post-it notes because this book is just so wonderful. I'm so excited to talk about it with you. And don't worry, I'm going to leave plenty of time for your questions because it's the worst when someone is just running their mouth and you're thinking, shut your cake hole, lady. I got questions. So don't worry, I will shut my cake hole and I will get to your questions. Dawn, I cannot tell you how much I love this book. I feel so nourished by your beautiful writing, by your prose, by your ability to bring this legendary woman to vibrant life, to blood and bones and desire and dreams and ambition, and to get to know her. I feel like I do know her now. And I want to know everything about your research process. Take us back to the moment you first knew you wanted to write about Jackie Kennedy and about how you started to dig into this woman over the next 10 years that it took you to write this book.
Thank you, Sara. And I'm just going to pause for 1 second. Thank you, Robert. Robert, thank you so much for creating this incredible event series. In the chat, I saw that one of our listeners today said, thank you for all of the wonderful programs that you do. And I just feel this experience, this program is such an opportunity for readers and writers to connect over, with a shared passion and love of books. And I've been watching through the chat and how many people are here from so many different parts of the country and so many different parts of the state. And I just want to thank you all for being here. I'm really grateful to have all of you with us tonight. And it was really actually, what's interesting is that it's really actually through a shared love of books that I first came to Jackie's story. And we know her, right? We think we know her. And not everyone knows that she was a ferocious bibliophile. She loved books.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she loved reading. And I came to the story at first when I was actually reading the idea for the story, the kind of the seed of curiosity, the first question. Because for me, this is my 5th novel, and all books begin with a question. all books begin with a driving question. And if you're fortunate, that question becomes the fuel that sustains you through the years that it takes to research and see a book through. And for me, the question that kind of drove the story of Jackie in this novel was, who was she underneath the woman we think we see? And that question first arose for me when I was reading aloud to my sons at night. They were much younger. This is about 15 years ago. So it was even before I embarked on the project, which is often the way it happens with a book. It happens like even years before you start writing or you start researching. And I was reading aloud to my boys at night, and we were reading from the collected works of the best loved poems, a collection of poems, the best loved poems of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And the introduction of that book was written by her daughter, Caroline. And in that introduction, Caroline spoke about her mother's passion for reading, her mother's passion for books, her mother's passion for poetry, and how books and reading and literature were an intrinsic part of their everyday life as a family, and of the everyday experience of her and her brother John. And towards the end of that introduction, she reflected on how the power of ideas and the words we use to express them is the greatest power that we have. And she attributed that belief to both of her parents. That had been an idea that had been passed down to her and her brother from her parents. And reading that for me, that night I was reading aloud to my sons in bed, it just galvanized something in me. You know, it created this entirely new lens for this woman who's so visible, one of, arguably the most photographed, woman in American history. Like, she's so visible. And this icon of American history, Jackie Kennedy. And I wanted to know, who was she? Like, what did she care about? I wanted to construct a story, not just around what happened to her, but I wanted to construct a story out of the things that she loved and the things that mattered to her. And one of those things that was a driving passion of hers throughout her life was a love of reading and a love of books. And that led to her 2-decade career as an editor at the end of her life. And so that became that first spark that really caused me to kind of turn toward her story and to her, and to consider that this might be a story that I wanted to work into. This might be a story that I felt led to tell.
Oh, Dawn, I love that you connected to Jackie, not just through your shared love of books, but through her daughter's dedication to her as you're reading that to your sons. I mean, the reciprocity of that and the multi-generational love of books is just so beautiful. And I'll be honest, I am not a Camelot, head or whatever they call them, a crazy Camelot lover. I know, obviously I'm a history lover, so I know the Kennedys through the lens of history, but I'm not one of those people who's obsessed with the Kennedys. And so I only knew the basic facts of Jackie. And I didn't even, I learned so much about her. I learned that she was this incredible water skier. And I just love what that says about her, that she was a woman who would, get hold on to being towed around a body of water, and that she loved nature and the sea and the beach, and that she and JFK were these incredible bookworms with this shared love of books. And that made me love her and connect to her humanity so much more. And I also love how ambitious she was, and how feisty and passionate she was. And I didn't know about that, because all I knew was sort of the reserved facade of her giving the tour of the White House. Tell us about how you learned about that and how that's connecting with readers.
Well, so I'm going to break that into a couple different responses. The first thing I want to talk about is actually the water skiing. So what's interesting is there's and it was a video, a very informal video that was shot in July 1962. And it was a video of Jackie water skiing, and there's 3 different segments of that video. And one of the segments is Jackie water skiing, solo, and she's on a slalom ski. So she's on one ski, it's on a mono ski. And there's an incredible grace and strength and athleticism in how she skis. And the reason that was compelling to me, and it was one of the videos that now is housed at the JFK in the archives of the JFK library, and it's in the public domain. But I was so curious about that particular image of her, skiing, because she's so good on water skis. Like, she's so athletic, she's so strong, and she has such grace. And then in a second clip in that same video, she's water skiing, also still on a slalom ski, alongside, on a second tow rope, the astronaut John Glenn, and who had been visiting their house in Hyannis and in Cape Cod. And I was so, again, curious, like, that's such an interesting image, right, of Jackie with this, this national hero who's like skiing next to her. And then, but there's a third component of that video. And the third component is Jackie water skiing, and she's holding her daughter, and her daughter is 5. And that was really, I mean, I don't know how many of our listeners have ever water skied holding their child. I certainly haven't.
No.
But not only did it speak to her strength and, physical strength, and also her determination, right, to do something. And she did it with incredible grace, but she also wanted to expose her daughter to that moment. She also wanted to expose her daughter, and Caroline looked so happy. Like, and so she also wanted to expose her daughter to that larger world and that spirit of adventure that was so much a part of who she was. And so for me, in my research, I was a poet before I was a novelist. And in my research, I really work into those granular pieces. So, finding those little details, and I've just kind of broken it down through one video, where you take a video and you sort of like are taking apart what those pieces say about her character that might be different from dimensions of her character that have been highlighted in other sources. Because I wasn't really interested in the salacious details. I wasn't really, for me, this process of research was a distillation. It was not so much an excavation, because there's so much material that's out there, but it's a distillation of the myth and the layers of myth and media, and what Jackie herself once called the river of sludge. Like, I wasn't interested in the sludge. I was really interested in who she was, what drove her. And I wanted to ground this novel, which is a biographical novel. I wanted to ground it in the historical record, because I feel like women are so often, Jackie wasn't caricature. She wasn't cardboard. Like, she was a really fascinating and brilliant woman who also had an incredible passion for art, an incredible passion for books, a profound commitment to her family, to her children, to her husband, and to her country, and to the values that have been founding values of the country. She had an incredible integrity. That was really, really interesting to me. And again, not necessarily dimensions of her that have always been highlighted in everything that's out there. And so, but I could find it. I just had to sort of like, sort of mine those pieces and then build them into a narrative, like around the kind of like the bones, the events of her life.
Well, I love how you did it. And I love, again, I think I had this vision of this, this elegant woman in a column dress, with with her 60s hair and, and her pearls and her gloves. And to think about her, water skiing is the polar opposite of what I had envisioned. And I loved that. And I loved, knowing that one of her teachers said that Jackie had a bit of the devil in her. And I loved that her high school, intention was not to be a housewife. And I just learned about this full-bodied, red-blooded, incredibly intelligent, ambitious woman, well-read, ferociously intellectual. And I really came to respect and care about her and feel like I know her through the pages of your book. So I loved that.
Well, and JFK was once asked to describe his wife in one word. And the
Ooh.
word he used was fey, F-E-Y. And that too, that was another sort of something that was so intriguing to me because, and I dug into that, like, what does that mean? Like, what did that mean in his mind? It's someone who, again, it has a scent of like the strategic, a scent of like, fairy-like, but also very nimble and deft and intriguing. But it was an interesting word. And there is nothing kind of plastic about it. Like, it's a very vital, light, and curious and fascinating word. And so those are the types of facts that I was really looking to kind of find, like those things that were revelatory, those dimensions of her that are in the historical record that can be researched, that, everyone has access to. But in order to bring her to life, in order to bring her internal world to life, because when we think about the events of her life, she lived a remarkable life. And she did extraordinary and remarkable things after living through, an act of unthinkable violence that she was witness to, that she experienced a loss, a shattering loss. Like, and she then stewarded our country, not just through the next 4 days, but she also stewarded, she was committed to certain initiatives that JFK had begun during his presidency, and she was committed to, seeing them through. The Civil Rights Bill, the moon landing, like, these were things that she worked strategically, to kind of help make sure that his legacy persisted. And that again, like, that's a dimension of her that, yeah, it's known, but it's not always highlighted. The light hasn't always been, sort of like, placed on those dimensions of her character. And that's what I was really interested in. That's what I was intrigued by.
Yeah, I had no idea. And I love the image of you, excavating the historical record. During your excavation process, what was the most surprising thing to you that you unearthed?
The thing I wasn't expecting to find is that I really feel like they were in love. I really feel like this was a love story. It's complicated, a complicated love affair, absolutely. And there were real challenges. And many of them are known, and some of them are less well known. And yet I feel like there was a profound intellectual connection between them, and they were often the two smartest people in the room. Like, that again, like, is really interesting. And so it wasn't just the kind of the glitz and the glamour that I was so interested in. It was the power of their minds, the fact that they were both passionate readers, that Jackie in the Schlesinger tapes, like, she describes how her husband was always reading. Like, he was reading when he was tying his tie. He was reading when he was getting dressed. He was reading, before bed, like when he woke up, like, he was always reading. And that too was so interesting to me. They were both committed to, poetry and art and literature as being a part of the cultural landscape of his administration, and recognizing, JFK gave an incredible speech on the relationship and the kind of tensile dynamic and dialectic between poetry and politics. Like, that's something that has remained. Like, that is a dimension of his legacy that has continued. And I really love that he understood that the role of the artist was also linked to cultural politics, and culture politics and power. And that was, again, these sort of dimensions of who they were, and they were joined in these ways. And the White House, you know, the restoration of the White House that she was creating, it wasn't that she was restoring it to its exact historical past, but she was restoring it to an integrity based in the values, the founding values of America. And she was creating a kind of stage where her husband's administration, you know, his sort of emergent leadership could continue to grow and evolve. And those dimensions of how they thought, that kind of strategic thinking, was a real bond between them. And towards the end of his life, you know, he at one point reflected to someone that he knew, a friend of his, that, you know, there's only one woman I could have married, and I married her. And those types of, finding those types of details about their relationship and about their closeness and about their bond and the regard that he had for her was not something I was expecting to find. The way they drew so close, the way the sort of the temperature and the climate of their intimacy really changed in the wake of their son Patrick's tragic death in August 1963, that again, like how that altered their relationship and how that changed their relationship was not something that I expected to find.
Dawn, as a writer and as a yogi, I am also a bit of a mystic. And I noticed that as readers, we are drawn to certain stories. There's more books than we could possibly ever read out there. And as writers, there's more stories than we could possibly ever tell out there. And so I noticed that as readers, we're drawn to stories that we need to read. And as writers, we're drawn to stories that we need to tell. What do you think drew you to Jackie?
Well, part of it, again, like I said, I mean, it was some of these dimensions of her character. I sometimes get frustrated when women aren't seen as their whole selves. And I think we see Jackie as a wife, we see her for her hair and her style. And yet she often said that her sister, Lee, was the one who had a passion for beauty and for, you know, Lee was the one who was into fashion. Jackie often, said that she would prefer to just dress like an ionic column. And again, those types of things, like she was so witty, she was so smart, she was so quick. And sometimes her wit could be biting. But the other dimension of her that I uncovered again and again and again in my research, particularly from accounts of people who had known her personally and people who had been close to her, even in an everyday way, was her genuine warmth. And again, that was not, because her wit is legendary, but her warmth, not as legendary. And those dimensions of her, the way, like when she was a book editor, later on in her life, she championed like a diverse, eclectic list, really extraordinary authors, like, whose voices had not always been heard. That's another dimension of her character that we don't always think of. She created, when she was creating a house on Martha's Vineyard, she'd bought a piece of land and she was laying the house out with string with her friend Bunny Mellon, and she was and she didn't build a tremendous house. Like, she built a house, she wanted to build a house that her children would want to come home to. Like, that was so interesting to me. She wanted to build a house that had comfortable chairs where people would want to sit. Like, that said, again, so much about the type of person that she was and the types of things in life that she valued. And those felt not aligned with the sort of that kind of glossy, glitzy image that we often associate with her. And those were dimensions of her and her character that were so interesting to me. The fact that towards, in her 2-decade career as a book editor, she usually did not want her name in the acknowledgements. preferring rather to erase her own influence and authorship. That again was a dimension of her character for a woman who's so visible and yet is interested in kind of, being less seen. That's again, those disconnects are part of what is so intriguing to me when I feel drawn to a story. If I hadn't found so many of those early on in my research, and they're kind of everywhere, but if I hadn't found them, if you're looking for them, if I hadn't found so many of those early on, I don't know that I would have been as compelled by her story. But that's what was interesting to me, was the sort of the discrepancy between how we think we see her and what really drove her, and what's there, as sort of documented as having driven her. It's not like I'm making that up. It's that it's there. It's just that that's not what we have always been looking at. And I think that's so often the case with women's stories, particularly women who are in roles like, as Jackie was, and many first ladies are, a role that's adjacent to power. And that is often the role of the woman. That's often the role of the wife. And I just wanted to kind of tell, sort of reinterpret, or to interpret her story. We think sometimes of novels as being, we create this divide between fiction and nonfiction, and yet nonfiction accounts, historical accounts, are interpretations too. And, they're interpretations that depend on the selection, the elision, and the assembling of facts into a narrative arc. And fiction, I believe, can be a different kind of mechanism, a different kind of, a different way of cutting into an experiential, truth is kaleidoscopic, and fiction can be another means of accessing an emotional or psychological truth that allows us to come to a new understanding of a person or an era or a life. And in this particular case, I felt like fiction was going to be the best way for me to explore her interior life.
Oh, Dawn, I love what you just said. Truth is kaleidoscopic. That is so beautifully and incisively said. And I think one of the many things that I love and admire about this book and you is your incredible efficiency and the perfect selection of each word, which now knowing that you were a poet before you were a novelist makes perfect sense, because what I admire and cannot do myself is to be super efficient with words. And I love that really just sort of sums up this, what I love about this book, the beautiful word choice and your exploration of how kaleidoscopic this woman can be. And I loved, there's so many lines that I loved in this book, but one of the many that I loved is, what would have happened if I had made a different choice all those years ago? And why does it seem like such a radical thing, the idea of a woman in love with her own life? Because I seek to be a woman who in love with her own life and to create a life I love. And I just, again, your efficiency with words, your word choice, and summing her up and in the essence of the story, I love it so much.
Thanks.
Another thing I love is how you poetically, now it's all making sense as a poet, that you put these little scenes into the chapters of whether it's about light or, a moment with, whether, or china or a piece of furniture or a look exchanged between them. And then you just end the scene there and let that live in our imaginations. Can you talk about, from a craft perspective, your choice to put these moments, to sprinkle these moments in?
Well, I think one of the things that I knew that I wanted to do, it's a long book. It's over 400 pages, but it's a fast book. And one of the reasons it's fast is because it is, there are like these little, like what Sarah's referring to, there's like these bits of, these cuts, these bits of white space. And I often feel, for me structurally, I really felt like her story deserved that white space.
Oh,
And what I mean by that is the reminder that there's so much that we don't know. And I'm still compelled by this woman. And that's really, really interesting. And I know that, when I finished Georgia, and I worked on Georgia, which was, the biographical novel about Georgia O'Keeffe, and I worked on it for, I think, 6 years. And when I finished that book, and I was so compelled by that story, but when I finished it, I was done. Like, I had some friends who were like, oh, we're going up to a exhibit at the MFA, or we're going down to a show down in New York. Do you want to come? An O'Keeffe show? And I'd say, nope, all set. But with Jackie, there are so many things that I feel like there's left, that there is left to discover. There's so many ways, there's so many choices that she made in her life that I, as a woman, as a mother, as sort of someone who's committed to service in the broader world, as someone who's committed to books and stories and a culture of reading and connecting with readers, there's so much that I still have to learn. And she was someone, and again, like, these little pieces of her that are unexpected, that are surprising, that were exhilarating to me as a writer, and I hope will be exhilarating to readers, is she was a nail biter, and she read Reinhold Niebuhr for fun, like the theologian, like for fun. Like, she was always reading. She loved the books of the Irish writer. She loved the novels of the Irish writer Edna O'Brien, who is also one of my favorite all-time writers. She snapped up the translation rights of Egyptian writer Naguib Mahfouz, who was the Nobel Prize winning Egyptian writer, and she was the first person to translate him into English. And again, like, there's so many details still to learn about who she was and how she led. We forget that sometimes, as a woman, and how she led as a mother, and the choices that she made in order to go on and go back to work, for the last 20 years of her life, and to work right up to her death, to continue to go back to work, even though, and she talks at one point, there's a passage in the novel that I do really like, and I'm going to read it briefly if you don't mind.
We would love to hear that in your
voice. It comes towards the end of the novel, although I wrote it early on. The world has divided my life into 3: life with Jack, life with Onassis, life as a woman who goes to work because she wants to. My life is all of these things, and it is none of these things. They continue to miss what's right in front of them. I love books. I love the sea. I love horses, children, art, ideas, history, beauty, because beauty blows us open to wonder, even the beauty that breaks your heart.
Oh, I also have that underlined in my book, and I love that line.
Yeah, and that was that idea of sort of a woman who's able to see her life from the outside, who's aware that the world is sort of seeing her life, and at the same time, a woman who's deeply, deeply, deeply committed to living her life. And Jackie said at one point, even though she was a photographer and she worked as a reporter who also, she had a column before she married Jack called, the Inquiring Camera Girl, and she did take photographs of people in the street, and she kind of did always do these interviews. She often said, I'd rather live my life than record it. Like, she didn't necessarily want to record her life in photographs. I don't think she would have been a fan of Instagram. I don't think that would have been something, or social media. Like, she wanted to be in life. And that was the Jackie that was interesting to me. And yet she was also aware of that the world was constantly kind of looking at her. And she described herself once, and this was another kind of one of those passages that I found really fascinating. She described herself once as an outsider, which is and a very hard thing to be in American life. And again, that was one of those other little bits that kind of talked about that difference, that disconnect between how the world saw her and how she saw herself. She saw herself as an outsider, and I don't know that people would necessarily describe her that way.
Oh, yes, I am loving this conversation. And John, I know you and I both really care deeply about connecting with readers. And I want to turn this over to the audience so that the people who have questions for you get them heard. So first we have from Ruth. She says, "Hi, Dawn. Why is Rose Kennedy mentioned so infrequently in this novel compared with her husband?"
That's a great question. I was really intrigued by the relationship between Jackie and Joe. And I was also intrigued by the amount of power that Joe had on shaping the direction of Jack's life in the wake of Jack's older brother, Joe, in the wake of his death. Because originally Joe Jr. was supposed to be he was the golden child. He was the one that was supposed to be, picking up the Kennedy mantle. And when he was killed, that then fell to Jack. And it was, for Jack, it was a reluctant burden. It was not, it was a reluctant sort of mantle that he took on. And he would, when he and Jackie talked, and again, this is in the historical record, it's also in the book, is that when he and Jackie would talk about what he was going to do, after, his presidency, he thought, maybe I'll teach, maybe I'll write a book.
Maybe I'll write.
And he was, again, going back to that sort of shared, that kind of shared world of the intellect and the shared world of stories that they both inhabited. And that was interesting to me. His tastes in literature tended more towards the nonfiction and history, and biography. But he asked a friend of his once, and again, this was another one of those kind of like little quotes that became something that is in the novel, and I built then a scene around it. Is he asks a friend, he says to a friend of his, he reflects, like, what's so interesting about biography is the question underneath it: who was he? Who was that person? Who was the subject? And that again, like so that relationship between Joe and Jack, and Joe and Jackie, and Joe and power, because power is one of the things that really drew me to Jackie's story. It's one of the things that really drew me to George's story, is this relationship that women have with the power that is around them, and how these remarkable women learn how to harness that power to forge their own life and to build a life based on their own vision and their own integrity. And Joe was intrinsically a part of that kind of swirl of power and expectation, and the kind of triumph that comes with that, and the burden that comes with that. That answers your question.
Thank you, Ruth. Okay, so we're gonna get, Ruth had two questions. We're gonna go to someone else's, then come back to Ruth. This one's from Susan. She says, "Jackie was critical of her son's girlfriends. Do you think she would have approved of who he married? As it has been written that their marriage was tempestuous?"
As a mother of two sons, I don't know. I don't know how she would have felt about the woman that her son ultimately married. I do know that she adored her son. I do know that she adored both of her children, and her identity as a mother was fundamental to her character. And it's not something that I would sort of claim to know that answer to. There are certain things that I wouldn't necessarily, that I couldn't know, and I wouldn't claim to know. And I did have there's a moment in the book where she's reflecting on one or two of her son's girlfriends, and how she's reflecting on them feels aligned with the integrity of her character. And the way I chose to write that expresses as well, reflects as well, a line that I feel was a line that I had to adhere to when I was kind of shaping those moments.
I think that is a fair and very reasonable line you drew and adhered to. This one is from Ellen. She says, I'm curious to know if someone who knew Jackie as a person has read the book and gotten in touch with you as to whether or not they think that you got her right.
So that's a great question. I have actually heard from three people who knew her and who feel like I have done a good job with, and that I've done justice to her character. One I'm having dinner with in a week and a half. So that'll be, and I can report more afterwards when I get some more details. I also know that I'm a novelist, and I have chosen to, this book is fiction in the sense that it's written first person. It's written from Jackie's point of view. I feel like I knew enough, and I still know enough that I could have written a biography. But I chose not to use that lens to explore this particular woman, because I was really interested in her, in that interior space.
Oh.
And I don't feel, her step brother, that's what she called him, Gore Vidal, her step, actually in his novel, Burr, has an incredible line about the difference between fictional biography and biography, biographical fiction and biography, where he says that a good biographer's job is never to attribute motive. And when you write a novel, which he claimed that Burr was, even though it was written third person and it was as highly researched as a biography, he claimed that the difference was that a good biographer never attributes motive. What you would, if you read 4 to 5 biographies of Jackie Kennedy, if you go and you take out 4 to 5 different biographies of Jackie Kennedy and you read them back to back, the way the way a novelist does when they're sort of researching a subject, you will realize that each of those biographies, even though they adhere to the same, the sort of salient facts and events, they are interpretations. Depending on the selection of facts, the kind of like the slight conclusions that are drawn, the slight interpretations and the lenses that are imposed. And it's a really fascinating process to do that when you're researching as a novelist, when you're researching a subject, is to like back to back, like one right after another. And you realize how even nonfiction is an interpretation.
Amen. And I don't think that gets talked about enough. This one's from Stephen. The statement about translating the Egyptian writer seems to imply that Jackie spoke Egyptian, which sounds unlikely. Did she translate the writer from French to English, perhaps?
So, no, great question. And so she bought the translation rights. So she edited she did not translate that book. She edited she was the editor who acquired the English translation rights, and there was an English translator, and then she was his editor. So she stewarded that book into English, but she did not translate it. Thank you for that clarification. She was multilingual. Like she spoke many languages, And that is something that I think is a well-known fact about her. And again, but it's an interesting fact about her. And it's a dimension. She loved to sort of learn the language, the customs, and the history of countries that she traveled to when she was traveling in a state capacity, and also later when she was, she loved to travel. And when she was traveling later, when she moved to Greece, when she was married to Onassis, there were dimensions of Greek history and Greek customs, Greek dance, Greek literature that she was really excited to explore and learn.
Ooh, this is a good one. From Nancy, how did Jackie make her peace with Blackjack Bouvier? So yeah, her father, because you spend some time on her relationship with her father, and I loved that part.
How did she make her peace
With Blackjack Bouvier.
with Blackjack Bouvier? And I'm really curious, and I wish that I could ask this question to the person who posed it, is what dimension of him, right? Because there were so many aspects of him, and there were so many aspects that had such profound influence on her. Her father was a kind of well-known, you know, his affairs, he was a philanderer, and he was known for that. And there was a photograph, there was a really powerful photograph of her mother, Jackie's mother, they were still married, sitting on a fence, and then Jack, her husband, Jack Bouvier, holding hands with another woman, when she's sitting right there. And there, you know, he had multiple affairs when Jackie was a child, and Jackie was aware of those affairs. And that was kind of very much a part of, you know, that was one of the reasons her parents' marriage broke down. I think what was maybe harder for Jackie is that she adored her father, and her father worshiped her. And so that too creates a, you know, they had he called her Jax, and he would come up to her, you know, to visit her at school, and they figured out a way that she could keep her horse there. And, you know, and then he would take her friends all out for lunch, and they would tear around in his little convertible. Like, she absolutely adored her father, and he was a really complicated man, and he didn't come to her wedding. And the reason the press was given was that he had a cold, and the actual reason is that he was drunk. He was kind of, you know, drunk or hungover, and so he wasn't there. He didn't walk her down the aisle. And so the question, how did she make her peace with him? I think she always deeply, deeply loved him. And I think it was also a really, really hard relationship for her. And him not being present at her wedding was for her heartbreaking. So it's complicated, right? That's not necessarily a wrapped up answer, but I think so many of the things that you discover when you're researching for an historical novel or for a biography is that there are always these loose ends that we live on. And that's true of life, and it's also true of historical figures.
Right, because that's what's true for humans.
Relationships
We're
you don't always
complicated.
make your peace with.
Yeah.
She did make sure. This is powerful. This was a powerful moment for me. She did make sure that there were summer flowers on his casket, because those were flowers that she loved and that he loved. Yeah, when he passed away.
This one from Kathy. She wants to know, did you connect with any Kennedy relatives in researching this book?
Yep, great question. No, I don't actually ever I don't ever try to connect with people in person who knew the subjects that I'm writing about. I love, though, I love to read transcribed interviews. I love to read personal interviews, personal reflections, you know, that are done with people who knew the subjects of my novels. And I just personally don't talk about my work when I'm creating it.
Yes.
I don't really talk about it with anyone, and I don't necessarily, it's what's really important for me is to be able to kind of distill, you know, again, like to kind of mine and distill the facts that are there that I find, like those anecdotes that are there. Those are really powerful to me. One of the most powerful transcripts that I read actually was a transcript that of an event that took place at the JFK Library, and it was called The Literary Life of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And it was, you know, a number of people who talked about her love of books and her career as an editor. And that was fascinating to me, as were Caroline's, as have been Caroline's words about her mom and Caroline's words about her father, and also John's words about his mom, because those told me so much, not just about who she was, but how she how, you know, who she was as a mother, not who she was, not just who she was as a person, but who she was as a mother. Another source that was incredibly impactful for me were the have been the books of Clint Hill, who was her Mrs. Kennedy and Me, was an incredible book. It is an incredible book.
This one is from an anonymous attendee, and they would like to know, was Jackie's marriage to Onassis one of convenience, or was she in love with him?
Great question. So he was hard for me to write, because there were a lot of things about him that I struggled with, and I just felt like there were a lot of ways that I felt like he was not kind to her. At the same time, you know, I really wanted to discover what it was about him that she felt drawn to. He was an incredible storyteller. He was an incredible storyteller. And I think that was really compelling to her. I also think he really, really, really wooed her. You know, I think he really, really, really tried to marry her. That was something that was very important to him, whether he loved her, whether he was trying to kind of acquire her. But I think that was important to her at a time where so much in her life felt unstable. I also feel that that he could keep her children safe. And I don't think we can underestimate that particular fact. I don't think that I can overstate that particular fact. She really believed that he could keep her children safe. And in the wake of her husband's assassination, in the wake of Bobby's assassination, if you really look at many of the choices that she made in the course of her life, after, you know, from the time her children were born, and then, you know, also after Jack's assassination, when she was making those choices alone, she made so many choices, her passion for her children, her commitment to her children really determined so many of the choices that she made. And that to me says so much about who she was as a person and her integrity as a mother. And then that again was really interesting to me and really compelling to me. The last thing I want to leave you with before we start to close this conversation, because I'm aware of the time, is that there was another, just to be sharing this with readers, I want to share with you. She once said, there are many little ways to enlarge your child's world. Love of books is the best of all. And I want to share that tonight, because I want to share that to all of you who are listening and tuning in, because I know you're here through your libraries, and libraries are that space where we have the chance to kind of explore all sorts of books, all sorts of ideas, and to really come back to that to that truth that Caroline Kennedy wrote about in the collect, the best loved poems of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis in her introduction, that the power of ideas and the words we use to express them is the greatest power that we have. Books teach us empathy. Books remind us, they broaden our world. And I'm just so grateful to the libraries that we have as sources of connection and community, and the way that they bring us together. So thank you.
So I know we had a few more questions and we're out of time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I encourage you to follow Dawn on Instagram and Facebook, and I'm sure that Dawn will post a forum to answer more questions there, so that we can continue the conversation. And go to her website, dawntripp.com, where you can see all of her incredible upcoming events around Massachusetts and the country, and you can meet her in person and ask her these questions in person. Dawn, I want to thank you for the chance to speak with you about this beautiful, brilliant book. Robert, thank you for putting this event together. And you guys, this is such a wonderful book. And I want to remind you that signed books make the best gifts for self and others. So go to an event or order through Dawn's local bookstore, and she will go and sign it for you, and gift yourself the gift of this beautiful read, and for those you love in your life who love to read as well. Thank you so much for being with us. Good night.
Well, folks, yeah, let's give Sara and Dawn a virtual round of applause. I think Sara just about said it all there, and Dawn left us on a really positive, powerful message about libraries and readers. So I think I won't ramble on too much more, but just a reminder, look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, information about some other upcoming virtual author visits. I'll also include Dawn's website and socials in that email as well. So thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Sara. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks so much for being here.
Bye-bye.
Bye.